Sophie moved into an old house on the outskirts of town to start a new life. The house was large, with shabby walls and creaking floors, but there was something inviting about it. While sorting through the attic, she came across a dusty box hidden in the corner. When she opened it, she found a dozen dolls inside. They looked too realistic, like miniature versions of real people. Each doll was meticulously detailed, the smallest details of the face, the folds of the clothes, even small birthmarks and scars. "A real work of art," Sophie muttered, taking one out. The dolls made her slightly uneasy, but at the same time she couldn't take her eyes off them. One of them had thick blonde hair and a serious expression. The other had a short haircut and a wide smile. They were different, as if each had its own story. Sophie decided to keep them. She placed the dolls on a shelf in the living room, thinking they would add a little charm to the house. But from that moment on, her life began to change. The first night, she thought she saw one of the dolls turn its head slightly. Sophie attributed it to fatigue, but the next day, she noticed that the dolls were standing differently than she had left them. Sophie tried to ignore the strangeness. "It's just my imagination," she told herself. But every time she entered the living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The dolls changed positions. One day, she found them standing in a neat line, although she had left them all sitting on the shelf. Their arms, which had previously hung by their sides, were now raised, as if they were trying to reach out to each other. The dolls' eyes especially frightened her. In the evenings when she sat in the room, she felt their gaze, even if she looked in another direction. When she raised her head, one of the dolls' eyes were always directed straight at her, no matter which way she turned the figure. A few days later, one of the dolls disappeared. It was the one who stood with a smile that radiated goodwill. Sophie searched the entire house, but she could not find it. "Maybe she fell," she muttered, but that didn't explain why she was nowhere to be found. The next evening, returning home, she noticed that the door to her bedroom was slightly ajar. She was sure she had closed it. As she entered the room, Sophie froze. On her bed, neatly placed in the middle of the pillow, lay the very doll that had disappeared. Her smile seemed wider now, and her eyes looked with such intense attentiveness that Sophie's skin crawled. That night, she heard rustling. The sound came from the living room, where the other dolls were standing. Gathering her courage, she turned on the light and went in. The shelf was empty. The dolls stood on the floor, lined up in a circle, as if waiting for her. Sophie stared at the circle of dolls, not believing her eyes. They were perfectly aligned, their faces even more lifelike than before. The lamplight cast strange shadows on the walls, and she suddenly thought she saw one of the dolls slowly turn its head in her direction. Her heart pounded as she saw the smile on the face of the missing doll widen, and its eyes were now looking straight at her. "What's going on?" she whispered. But the only answer was a quiet, eerie rustling, as if the dolls had been moved the moment she blinked. The auditorium sparkled with spotlights from the next stage. Her gaze fell on the box where she had first found the dolls. She ran to it, hoping to find answers. At the bottom of the box lay an old, faded piece of paper. "Shelley," she said, being careful not to wake. "Dolls hold souls. Anyone who disturbs their peace will take the place of the next one." Sophie felt her legs buckle. Memories flooded her mind. She remembered one of the dolls looking suspiciously like a face she had seen in an old photograph she had found in the house. She had been terrified then, but now things came slowly back to her, so she took stock of the room. It all made sense now. The dolls weren't just toys. They were people. Their souls were trapped in those miniature bodies, and their expressions were forever frozen, reflecting the last emotions before they transformed. She tried to run out of the room, but her legs seemed to be giving out. The dolls were slowly moving, their heads were turning, their hands were raised, pointing straight at her. "No!" Sophie screamed, but at that moment, silence filled the room. The last thing she saw before everything went dark were the shadows of the dolls surrounding her. When the new tenants moved into the house, they found a box of dolls. Among them was a new one, with short brown hair and a scared expression. The dolls lined up on the shelf again, patiently awaiting their next victim.